I'm pleased to say that I've survived the sometimes frightening process of helping my 3 children learn to drive. And one of the biggest challenges for teens, and I think it applies to us as adults as well, is keeping your eyes on the road, right? Because you can spend too much time looking in your rearview mirror, thinking about what's going on behind you, or what you've left behind, or maybe even mistakes you've made, people you've cut off. You can be distracted by all the things going on right around you. It may be the scenery going by, or the bad drivers cutting in front of you, or the conversation in the car, or over your phone, or whatever it is. And yet we know that none of that will matter if you don't arrive safely at your destination. And I want to suggest that staying focused on your destination is also essential for spiritual life. You know, some people spend too much time looking back, longing for some good old days, or fixating on sins they've committed, or maybe that others have committed against them. Sometimes we get absorbed in just what's happening here and now, personal plans, conflicts, trials, temptations, current events, culture, politics. And yet, none of that will matter if you don't arrive safely at the right destination. And so I think in the Beatitudes, Jesus calls us to approach life with a destination in mind. Now, the word beatitude comes from a Latin word, beatus, which means blessing. Right? These are just blessings. And yet the blessing that Jesus describes, it's down the road. It's in the future. It's the destination that we should all be seeking. And I would say that if you do, it'll change how you relate to the past and to the present. So I've titled this series, Messiah's Blessing. But before we jump into Jesus' words, I think it'll help us to consider the context in his ministry and in the Gospel of Matthew. And so that's really where we want to focus today. You know, when we compare Matthew with the other 3 Gospels, Mark, Luke, and John, we find that Matthew does not follow a strict chronological order. He arranges his account around 5 discourses. The Sermon on the Mount is in chapters 5 through 7, and then in chapter 10 is the commissioning of the 12. Chapter 13 is the focus on the parables. Chapter 18 is a discussion of sin and forgiveness. And then chapters 24 and 25 is the Olivet discourse about the end times. So the Beatitudes come right at the beginning of that first discourse, the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the interesting thing here is Luke places that sermon around the midpoint of Jesus' 3-year-long ministry. But here Matthew moves it forward. He leads off with it as he begins his account of Jesus' ministry. Right? It really sets the tone for all that you read in Matthew. Now, for the first 4 chapters of Matthew, I titled my series on that, Messiah's Dawn. We started that back in November, December, and there Matthew shows us how Jesus is the king, the one who will fulfill Old Testament prophecy. Remember, he starts off with his genealogy and talks about his birth, of course, and then his baptism, his temptation in the wilderness, his calling of the first disciples. And we saw, as we worked through those chapters, that Matthew highlights the ways that Jesus' background really contradicts the Jewish people's assumptions about who the Messiah should be and how he should come. Now, we'll see that in the Beatitudes, then, Jesus really makes the same point about the experience of following him. It's probably not what you expect it to be. And you need to prepare yourself because he challenges our assumptions about what life here and now should be like. He shows us the path to blessing. How do we prepare? How do we start down that path? As Matthew introduces the Beatitudes, just the first 2 verses here, he mentions the people who are present. And I think that the distinctions between them really suggest 3 steps for starting down that path to blessing. The first is to acknowledge your need. Now, need is a slippery word, isn't it? I mean, when you have a lot, you speak of your wants as needs. And I find myself doing this all the time. I mean, I'll confess. It's a point of contention in my marriage. The refrigerator's full, but I say, we need food, right? Because the things I want are not there. We need ice cream. We always need ice cream, right? And the same thing happens with our health concerns. I get a minor pain, an ache, a cold, and I say, I need healing. But there's people who live with so much worse. It's what I'd want, but it's not really what I need. And yet our wants and our true needs, they're not completely separate. They're connected. And maybe this is a little abstract, but I sort of think of it as this huge, curved funnel, right? We cross we cut over the shallow lip of it all the time with those wants that we have. But it doesn't take too much to get pulled further down, right? And the slope gets steeper and steeper and harder to climb out of in your moments of deepest needs. So when Jesus proclaims the Beatitudes, he's surrounded by people who are acknowledging their need, at least in some sense. If we back up for a moment to Matthew 4:24 through 25, Matthew tells us, he gives us this summary of Jesus' ministry. He says, so his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis and from Jerusalem and all Judea and from beyond the Jordan. Now, these are not minor aches and pains, right? I mean, these needy people are desperate for relief from their afflictions. And the traditional location where this takes place, it's often called the Mount of Beatitudes, is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. And some of the regions that Matthew mentions here are as far as 100 miles away. And so you picture that. These people with their debilitating conditions are traveling all that distance on foot because they've heard stories about a man who could do miracles. Imagine that. And so their presence seems to have an effect on Jesus. It sparks something. Because look at how Matthew 5:1 begins. Matthew says, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. I mean, what does that mean? What does he see when he looks at them? Is he just exhausted from helping them? I mean, perhaps, it's probably part of it, but Luke, in his account, tells us that Jesus spends the whole night praying when he goes up on the mountain. On another occasion, Matthew 9:36 tells us he looks out at the crowds and he feels compassion for them because they're harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. I have to think he's having similar thoughts here. According to Luke, it's at this point that he chooses the 12 who would be his apostles right before he begins the sermon. But Matthew doesn't mention that. He comes back to those sorts of details later. Matthew wants us to see this connection between the presence of the crowds and this sermon that Jesus presents. Jesus saw all those immediate needs, all those needs that they felt, and he was relieving them. But I think the idea as we come into the Beatitudes is that he wants people to look further down that funnel, to the root cause of their needs. He's laying out the path of blessing, of what it means to be blessed, because that's what they're missing. Because they, and all of us, live in a world that is cursed. It's cursed with scarcity, with sickness, with death, with impurity, with conflict, with injustice. It's a fallen world. How did it get this way? And we know, as we read earlier, when God creates the earth, it is completely under his blessing. Genesis 1 and 2 talks about how he blesses the creatures and he blesses the first human beings, Adam and Eve. It's so good that he sets aside a whole day just to sit back and think about it, right? The seventh day. And there's plenty of food, there's no sickness, and best of all, there's no separation between God and man. But that all changes when Adam and Eve disobey the Lord. And so when you move on from that fall of man in Genesis 3, then we find that the blessing of God is much more limited. It's not pronounced in broad, sweeping terms anymore. You get to Genesis 7 and God floods the whole earth. It's under the curse. It's not till Genesis 9 after the flood that he blesses Noah. And then several generations go by until the Lord comes to Abraham, and Genesis 12 tells us that he blesses Abraham, and he says that he'll make him into a great nation and that in him all the families of the earth will ultimately be blessed. That's the storyline of Scripture. God's plan is to restore that blessing, that condition of blessedness that was lost. And so Matthew here, I think even as he begins his gospel, he's tying into that Abrahamic covenant because he shows right in the genealogy at the beginning that Jesus is a descendant of Abraham. He emphasizes that. Jesus is the one who can bring that about, who will fulfill it. So all that to say, when Jesus speaks about blessing, he's not talking about the bits and pieces that are just sprinkled here and there in this cursed world. I mean, every good thing is a gift from God. We should certainly be grateful and thankful to the Lord for those sorts of tiny blessings. But Jesus is pointing us forward to the ultimate solution, to the time when all our problems are fixed, to the time when the curse is reversed and the funnel is flattened and none of that is anymore. And so you have to see these Beatitudes, they just won't make any sense unless you acknowledge that all these wants and needs that latch onto our lives and try to pull us down, that all those are designed to point us up, to look at the Lord and to seek his ultimate blessing. So we have to acknowledge our need. And then secondly, and this maybe sounds so basic, but to come to Jesus. Now, here in Michigan, the mountains that we have, they're just not all that impressive. I mean, it's certainly not as flat as other spots in the Midwest, right? I mean, there's other states where you're driving along and you just can't see past the first row of corn in midsummer, right? Michigan's better than that. I'll give you that. But I mean, their tallest mountains, they're still less than 2,000 feet above sea level. Now, this location of the Sermon on the Mount, it's, like I said, it's often called the Mount of Beatitudes or Mount Eremos, and we don't know for sure that that's the place, but traditionally it's thought to be. It's even more humble than our mountains here in Michigan. Now there's this theme of mountains in the Bible. It's interesting to trace down. Maybe we'll do that sometime in outdoor worship services. But, Mount Sinai, back in Exodus, it ascends to 7,500 feet above sea level. And we talked about how Moses is up and down that mountain all the time. And then there's the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And it's not that tall, but it rises to around 2,400 feet above sea level. But this mountain, Mount Eremos, it only rises 650 feet above the Sea of Galilee. But the catch is that the Sea of Galilee sits almost 700 feet below sea level. So the summit of this mountain doesn't even reach above sea level. And yet, in some way, that just seems fitting as a spot for Jesus to show that the world's values are upside down. So, of course, there's a plain down below where the people are gathered, and from the plain to the mountain, it's still a climb, even though it's not that tall. And it's interesting, in Luke's account, he tells us Jesus went up, and then he came down from the summit, where he spent the night in prayer. And so perhaps there's maybe Luke talks about a level spot, right? So maybe there's a spot somewhere midway up the mountain. Because Matthew talks about the disciples coming to Jesus. Let's look again at Matthew 5:1, whole verse this time. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, here it is, his disciples came to him. Now you think about it, just looking at that verse, we can identify three different groups of people here. I mean, there's the unspoken group. There's undoubtedly many people in this region who have heard about Jesus, but they're not interested. They're not willing to come to him. They're not out on this hillside. Maybe it's because they're too self-respecting to chase after some upstart preacher. Maybe it's because life may not be great, but they take pride in their work and maybe their religion. Of course, there's others who would stay away because they don't want to feel the sting of any conviction over habitual sin in their lives, and that's kind of the world, isn't it? The respected and the detested. That's kind of how it breaks down. And neither of them have time for Jesus. But the second group, of course, is the crowd that we've talked about. And they've come because they're desperate, right? Their needs have driven them to the Lord. And we look at crowds, and sometimes we think, well, that's a sign of that kind of popularity. That's a sure sign of success. Crowds can be exciting. But if you read the whole story, you find out that crowds can be fickle too. I mean, do they see beyond just the desperation of the moment? Are they just coming to get something and then leave? Do they grasp really anything about who Jesus is or what he's doing? Why he's there? Will they just up and disappear afterwards? And so we come to the third group, the disciples. In Matthew makes a distinction here between them and the crowd. I mean, they're not just seeking to fulfill their felt needs. They've already come to Jesus in a sense. And that commitment is demonstrated here as they gather around him on the hillside. Now, admittedly, at this point, they still may not fully understand who he is or what he will ask of them, what he's trying to accomplish. But at the very least, they've decided to place some level of trust in him. And that's a starting point. Have you taken that step? Now we'll see from the Beatitudes in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount that being a disciple is not necessarily popular. The world likes people who conform to its values one way or the other. But it can be hostile towards someone who lives differently. In the last beatitude, Jesus speaks of enduring persecution on his account. Are we willing to take that risk? Because we'll see that it's unavoidable if you're to receive his blessing. At the end of the sermon, Jesus says that the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life. Few find it. I mean, is that how you think about Christianity? Because I suspect a lot of us are tempted to see the crowd and just assume that they're all disciples. I mean, everybody who gathers around. The fact of the matter is, lots of times people are still wrapped up in their own wants and needs and goals, just like the crowds here. They're on a different path. And so discipleship begins with coming to Jesus. And then one more step that I think comes out in this passage, and it's to learn from Jesus. Now, a lot of us approach learning as if we're preparing for a test. I don't know if you were good at doing that in your school days. I was pretty good at that. The teacher give you a list of facts. You go through it and cram it all into your head at the last minute. Walk in at the appointed time, spit it out on the test, and then promptly forget it, right? Because it hasn't made a lasting impression on you. That's kind of our approach to learning. And so you just forget most of it. And I'll be honest, it's real. We find the same sort of approach to learning in the church a lot of times. Bible colleges and seminaries tend to operate that way, just because that's what we think of when we think of education. And so it's no surprise, a lot of our Bible studies sometimes, a lot of sermons end up being just a recitation of biblical facts or theological ideas. And I think, of course, that's a better approach than just telling stories to amuse people or pulling on people's heartstrings to stir up some sort of emotion. Biblical and theological knowledge is important, but we find something more here in the ministry of Jesus. Matthew 5:2 leads into the Beatitudes by saying it this way. It just says, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and then it goes into it. It just makes me wonder, how does Jesus teach? We just read back in verse 1 that he's sitting down, which is interesting. It seems to have been a common thing among rabbis and philosophers of the time. And now here, Matthew says he opens his mouth to teach. Right? And the phrasing of that carries a sense of formality. I think the idea is that Jesus is speaking with authority. Because when you get to the end of the sermon, that's the response of the people. Matthew 7, verse 28 tells us that the crowds are astonished by the quality of the sermon, the authority that Jesus speaks with. And so I think we can say that Jesus' purpose, it's not just to inform, it's certainly not just to entertain or even to motivate. He seeks to shape the way that people think and to change the way that they live. We find that same kind of focus in Paul's writing to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, 1 and 2. He says, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. Now, of course, the authority of Jesus is unique. He's the Messiah. He's the Son of God. As Paul says here, he's the one who will judge the living and the dead. And so as his followers, as we preach and teach, we shouldn't be focused on just, airing our own personal views or our opinions or complaints. Right? Our job, my job particularly, is to represent his concerns by proclaiming his words under his authority. And so as Paul says there, that requires refuting error, showing what's wrong, rebuking sin. But he says it should be done in a way that's encouraging, that's patient, that's teaching, it's formative. That's the goal of teaching. Biblical teaching includes all of that. And so, going back to Jesus, understand his teaching with authority, but we should also note whom he teaches. Matthew says he taught them. But Luke's more explicit. He tells us that Jesus lifts up his eyes on the disciples as he speaks. And so the crowd, they're still around. They're still there. Some of them may have been close enough to hear what was happening and to listen in. And there are certainly other occasions when Jesus addresses the crowds directly. But here, he's focusing on shaping the lives of those who have made the commitment to follow him. And so before we examine his sermon in the coming weeks, we should all ask ourselves, am I coming to learn? Am I really willing to let Jesus shape the way that I think? Am I willing to let him change my opinions, my views? Am I willing for him to change my habits, the way that I live? Why? Because he's the Messiah. He's the Son of God, but also because he's showing us the path to blessing. Let me read his words, Matthew 5. These are the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So to start down that path, we need to acknowledge our need to come to Jesus to learn from him. Have you taken those steps? Because if not, I encourage you to begin following him today. If you want to learn more about this idea of God's blessing, the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Ephesians is a great place to read and learn more. Or perhaps you made a decision to follow Jesus at some point, but you've really drifted from it. Would you renew that commitment? Would you return to him today? Would you make that commitment to learn, to let him shape your life? And though Jesus focused on the disciples here, he doesn't forget the crowds. His goal is always for them to become disciples. And he's given us, his followers, that responsibility to call them to that commitment. And so think about that. Is there someone that you could invite to learn with you, to learn about Jesus, to learn from his words? Tell them about him. Tell them about this path of blessing that he's revealed. May we all grow to be more like Jesus.